Hi, my name is David Freitag, and this is my reflection on the time I spent at the University of Rhode Island in the summer at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy. So what did I learn? There were four major takeaways. The first one is kids need to talk to each other. My second major takeaway was inquiry is the root of personal learning. Reflection is so necessary, and don't lose sight of the big picture. So let's start off. Our first takeaway, learning is social. I really need to encourage kids to get talking to each other. There's traditional table talk, group work, talking to each other online, talking to themselves through reflection, talking to the wider world through Twitter, Google Hangouts, blogging. But in my practice, I've really only done table talk and group work, and really not that well. So my time at the Summer Institute really got me thinking it's time for a change. While I was attending the Summer Institute, I was also reading this book for a National Writing Project Advanced Institute called Transforming Talk into Text, and it just echoed a lot of the things that I was learning about at the Summer Institute. So here's a quote from that text. Even when students are the less active players in conversations, authentic discussions immerse the learners in procedures that become important when students write. So basically this idea that students are learning through their discussions, even if they are not the ones necessarily talking. Being part of the discussion helps you grow as well. I also I read this article by Renee Hobbs and Julie Coiro, which was about the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, and there were some quotes that really stood out to me from this article, particularly in relation to my own experience. This idea that creative partnerships inevitably involve creative tension, as the people we're drawn to may unsettle us. Indeed, it's that tension that stimulates and energizes innovation. So I think about my dyad partner and I were very different people. I come from high school. She comes from a university world, and she's much older, much more experienced than I am. I think we had a lot of that creative tension in our work together. Additionally, here's a part of a participant reflection from the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy. That participant said, collaborating with colleagues, making new connections, having material modeled, interacting with concepts, tweeting, starting friendships and encouragements of the heart provide motivation going into a new school year, and that's definitely something that I feel I've gained in addition to just the knowledge. I've gained kind of this motivation and this energy that I'm hoping to take with me into my practice this coming school year and beyond. Here's another quote about dyads and how they promote personal reflection in a social context. So this was, for me, a new relationship, being in a dyad and working with somebody on a project of this scale. And it did force me to articulate kind of what was my own identity as a teacher, what was the context of my work, and how did that interact with an overlap with my dyad partner's context, because we come from different places and we have different levels of experience and different interests and different goals. And that helped us, or I should say forced us to really dive into what our identities were so that we could align our goals for our project. So in working together, we had to refine our ideas. It took a lot more time. We learned it's very challenging to write a poem collaboratively, but I do think that we produce a pretty high quality work product, higher quality than I would have been able to produce alone, and I did feel like I grew from that process going through this, so I know this is something my students will benefit from as well. I read this article by Scott London called Thinking Together, The Power of Deliberative Dialogue, and here's a great quote from it. The Greeks introduced the idea that individuals could not be intelligent on their own. It was only by reasoning with others that they could uncover the truth for themselves. So this really flies in the face of this myth of the lonely genius writer. And having worked, and learned significantly socially, I don't really believe in the myth of the lonely genius writer. I'm more in line with the Greeks. London also talked about deliberation. And this quote has to do with a deliberative session. He said, the most powerful aspect of a deliberative session is the glimpse it offers of how people reason about public issues. Opinion polls and on-the-street interviews, the conventional mechanisms for capturing public sentiment, tell us very little about this process. At best, they give us a snapshot of where people think they stand. At worst, they offer a distorted and misleading view of how and what people are thinking. And so when I think about my students and the discussions they have, I want them to have deliberative discussions, not the kind of soundbite debates that opinion polls capture, but actual deliberative discussions. And when I think about the politics that I have been involved in and witnessed in my life, when I think about politics in the media, things like Facebook, cable, TV, opinion polls, you get a very bite-sized, reductionist, inaccurate portrayal of what people really think. But when I've been engaged in politics in person, when I've gone to the local school board meetings, I've watched local government on closed-circuit cable TV, I've had actual conversations with people, you tend to get involved in more of the deliberative process, which is a deeper level of thinking than just simply debate. There are also some pretty significant implications for our democracy, and we're creating citizens in school. So we need to get kids deliberating, because deliberative dialogue illustrates the consent of the governed is not some abstraction, it's not elusive, it's people playing a greater role in shaping the debate and setting directions for public policy by thinking together, not just talking at each other, but thinking together. So I identified as a watchdog during the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy. That's my digital literacy zodiac orientation. And because learning is social, I think we really need to teach kids how to talk to each other if we want them to have the most learning and if we want to create the citizens we need. So moving on to the second thing I learned is inquiry is at the root of personal learning. So this, again, I want to come back to Transforming Talk into Text, the book that I was reading as I was going through the Summer Institute. This also was in line with a lot of what I was learning at the Summer Institute. A quote from McCann was, "The inquiry-based approach had by far the most positive impact on the quality of students' writing." So McCann, a huge proponent of an inquiry-based approach for helping students become not just better thinkers, but better writers. So here are two ideas, one that comes from Julie Coiro and one from Chris Lehmann, about inquiry. Julie Coiro gave this great definition of personal learning, and she said, personal is something human, where the learner initiates and controls parts or all of the learning process. And this often emerges from engagement with others about one's personal wonderings, right? So I think that even kind of ties back to the idea of all learning is social. And then Chris Lehmann put it in this great quote, "If you assign a project and you get back 30 of the same thing, you gave a recipe, not a project." And so inquiry is this personal learning, not this recipe that you have to follow. Additionally, an inquiry-driven pedagogy is at heart about asking questions to which we do not know the answers, right? Which is exciting and piques natural curiosity. And that's a quote from Building School 2.0. So on the left you see here, Make Just One Change, which is a book about the question formulation technique developed by the Right Question Institute. And we went through this process at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy. And this idea of the question formulation technique plus the inquiry process gets kids to ask their own questions to which there may not be any answers that are clear or obvious. And then it gets kids to explore the answers to those questions. And so I did a very small version of this in my classroom and had kids doing some inquiry related to a Shakespeare play and then discussing the results of their inquiry. And when I had just a small version of this, like a couple lessons, I couldn't get my kids to stop talking, and I couldn't get them to stop thinking about what they'd been exploring. And so even in the kind of minor form that I've pursued this in my classroom, I've seen the really powerful effects of this method. My partner and I also did this, of course, for our personal inquiry project this summer. Another takeaway was when I read this article by Grant Wiggins about genuine versus bogus inquiry. Okay, so thinking about what does good inquiry actually look like? Well, we need some starting points and we need some boundaries for kids as well, so that they've got a direction to go in. And we need to do that through, Grant Wiggins argues, through essential questions which can guide our inquiry. And he talks about essential questions needing to be everywhere. He says at every turn, the essential question looms large in the unit. And this article that he wrote on his blog was about how if the essential question is not everywhere, all over, throughout the unit, if you do not keep coming back to it, and if it doesn't infiltrate every aspect of it, it's not providing the kind of direction that it could that would really enhance an inquiry unit. And again, the whole point of having these kinds of questions is for students to go through a gradual release model. Basically, as they face progressively more challenging intellectual problems, that they would continue to take more and more responsibility for themselves. And I think that inquiry really does make learning personal and put a lot of the onus back on students to create a more student-centered class. So there's also this blog post by Maria Popova called The Art of Thought, a pioneering 1926 model for the 4 stages of creativity. And it was about Graham Wallace's analysis in some writing he did in 1926 about the processes involved in being creative. And the 4 processes are, number 1, preparation, so gathering resources and learning as much as you can. Number 2, incubation, so kind of letting those ideas marinate while you set the problem down or work on other problems for a period of time. Number 3, illumination, kind of when your eureka moment hits. And 4, verification, where you bring what you've learned and what you've done into the world through some sort of product. So students actually go through each phase of this creativity process when conducting inquiry. It's something I realized as I was reading this article, and I realized that I've gone through this process as well at the Summer Institute and in the creation of any creative product that I produced. I think in particular in my classroom, we haven't given time for incubation. That's something that I want to plan in the calendar when I'm mapping out units for this school year, that I want to increase this incubation time for my students is something that, in reflection of my own personal practice, that I need to allow more time for, because that's certainly something that I did this during the Summer Institute when I was reading other books. At the same time, I would kind of put my mind on a different problem in the evening, and particularly when creating this reflection. I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about it and putting it aside and letting those ideas marinate before really coming back to create my final creative project. So the third takeaway from the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy that I got was that reflection is so necessary. Reflection really is metacognition. It forces you to analyze your thinking processes. It forces you to understand your experiences because you have to process it. And there's again that quote from John Dewey: we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. So after reflecting daily at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy, I had to summarize, I had to organize my knowledge, I had to simplify what I was learning into a 90-second video. And this is really valuable because I was kind of drinking from the fire hose of knowledge every day, and this made things much more manageable to kind of distill the most important lessons out of what I was doing. But I think, unfortunately, I have also rarely asked my students to reflect, and this is something that I need to incorporate into, I think, all major projects, and even along the way at different, kind of stops in the process to get students thinking metacognitively so they're aware of their own thinking processes. So here we have Marshall Jones on the left, and he wrote a spoken word poem called Touchscreen, where he reflected on the human consequences and costs of technology use. And a great passage from this was, he said, "But with 3,000 friends online, only 5 I can count in real life, why wouldn't I spend more time in a world where there are more people that like me?" And that line really, it struck me when I heard that, because I felt like I kind of identified with that. I have probably a handful of really close friends, and I have, I have 2 Facebook accounts with hundreds of friends each. And I haven't really reflected on that. And I think that with technology, there's so much energy and enthusiasm involved with kind of playing around and using the tools, and that you get lost and you don't always reflect on, what are the costs and consequences? How is technology really changing me as a human? So after we do anything, particularly something involving technology, after we have an experience, we need to reflect on it. If you don't reflect, you don't learn. And if we don't reflect and learn, we'll have no hope of creating a relationship with technology where, as Marshall Jones puts it, our technology is advanced enough to make us human again. And that leads me to my last takeaway from the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy was, don't lose sight of the big picture. It's all about the people. So here again we have Chris Lehmann on the left. I was really impressed by his keynote speech, and the big idea that he had to start with was, we now have the tools to create the schools that our kids deserve. We have the tools to realize John Dewey's dream because of technology. We have the ability to do things at speed, and the reason we should do this is because we have to give kids the schools that they deserve. And Chris tied it back to his own children, and he said, I don't want anyone to look at my son and just think disaggregated subgroup, right? He wants learning to be personal. Parents send me the best thing they've done ever, every single day, right? And Chris made this point that very few professions have the kind of leap of faith involved. That when people send us their children, they're taking a huge leap of faith, and so we need to create citizens because we've been entrusted with such a huge responsibility. We don't want to shoot for just creating good workers. We need to shoot for good people, good citizens. Additionally, school is not just about one thing. It's not just about STEM or just about the humanities. An engineer who doesn't understand the humanities will recreate the atomic bomb, and the poet who doesn't understand statistics will be lied to. Another great Chris Lehmann quote. And again, I think that in all of this rush to create the schools that our kids deserve, we sometimes forget that the tech is not the point, the work is the point. The tech is the tool. So I could continue quoting Chris Lehmann for many more minutes, but to move on here, I want to move into another idea that got me thinking, that Chris brought up, that got me thinking and reflecting on some of my own practice. So he said it's the ultimate act of hubris to think we could change the life of a child without being changed ourselves. And he kept bringing up this idea that we teach kids and not subjects. So I think back to my first year of teaching, where I went in there, brand new teacher, and I pretty much acted like I was teaching a subject. And it was awful. I wasn't enjoying myself. The kids weren't having a great time. But as I continued to teach throughout the course of the year, I changed. I was transformed. And I got to know my students. I got to know their lives and their stories. And that taught me, I learned that I was teaching kids and not English. And after my first year of teaching, I wrote a This I Believe poem. And I'm going to put a link in the video description when I post this on YouTube. But I think that I think it's easy to forget this lesson, that we teach kids and not subjects, and that the kids transform us just as much or more than we ever attempt to transform them. And so it's easy to forget that. And I think that my time at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy really helped drive that home again in my mind. So I also read this fantastic book by Chris Lehmann and Zach Chase called Building School 2.0, and I really, the last two chapters really hit home with me. The second last chapter about not being a martyr, right, and kind of being humble in the impact you have. If you think you're God's gift to teaching, you haven't been teaching long enough, right? And I think that teachers put a lot of pressure on themselves to really affect as much change as possible in students, but you know what? If we weren't there, somebody else would be. And so sometimes you need to step back and just remind yourself of that. But at the same time, teaching really is an amazing profession. It affords adults a window into and hand in the construction of discovery and learning like few other professions can offer. And so, just a reminder, right, to stay in awe and to appreciate teaching, but also to stay humble and not get too lost in not seeing the forest for the trees. So again, I think if it's all about the people, learning should and can be full of joy, right? And I thoroughly enjoyed my time at the Summer Institute in Digital Literacy. I think because I was doing a lot of joyful learning, and because I was learning so socially and pursuing projects that I was interested in. I think about the MIT Media Lab and the idea of lifelong kindergarten. And I don't think that necessarily has to be limited to some fantastic faraway place like MIT, where there are really intelligent people who are doing super awesome creative work. That can really be a metaphor and a model for the work we do everywhere. Again, this idea that Chris Lehmann brings up, and Chris and Zach bring up in the last chapter of their book, this idea that teachers are really lucky because of the work we get to do, particularly because most people simply don't feel as much as we do. All right, and that connects back to this idea I have in my mind about how it's all about the people involved, and about the kids that you connect with, and that's really what makes learning important. It's the reason we do it. It's the reason that everybody works so hard at it, and it's what makes it fun. So going back to what did I learn? 4 things. Kids need to talk to each other. Inquiry is the root of personal learning. Reflection is so necessary, and don't lose sight of the big picture. It's all about the people.